The sweep-up batter right now, Steve Meyers. Steve Meyers, a fellow Floridian, a serial entrepreneur. He owns a small drone company here in Florida. He's going to talk about the private use, the hobbyist use of drones, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being here. Grant, thank you for the introduction. And I come to you from a little different perspective. My perspective is I have an IT and data engineering background, and then as Grant mentioned, small business. So I'm not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV. So keep that in mind that I'm about for-profit and, excuse me, making money. So I think we all know that the UAS is truly a revolution, and I think it's important to understand that it's a revolution of innovation. It's not a revolution of invention. The UAS industry now has been an intersection of commoditization and miniaturization. And so we've taken the technology that's been used and demonstrated in the military. UASs were first used in the Civil War. You guys probably know that. It was with lighter-than-air balloons, and they had bombs on them that were floated across enemy lines. Didn't work out very well. The UAS really didn't come into use until the Vietnam War after Gary Powers got shot down in the U-2. That's really what advanced a lot of the UAS stuff in the military. But my point is that the FAA has had the opportunity to deal with the UAS and the industry and the laws for decades. And so you're saying it took 5 years to go from the recommendations to where they first came out for their public comment.
5 years, 10 months, 15 days, but who's counting?
There you go. And I think that's just a byproduct of the United States and its bureaucracies. And I think you'll find at the end of my brief comment that time and technology waits for no one, not even the FAA. So the paradigm shift is the ability, like as I mentioned, the commoditization, the miniaturization, is now the technology is available to John Q. public. So you can buy a Phantom for $700 or $1,200, and you can go fly it and get pretty good imagery if you're talking about real estate. And that's what a lot of commercial use is right now. When people talk about it, they talk about the independent real estate agents that are going out there taking aerial photographs of either houses or boats and that kind of stuff. And the FAA is, for the most part, has left them alone unless they've advertised it on YouTube. But the point is that it's not really about the UAS. The UAS is nothing more than a platform. It's nothing more than a tool. And while it certainly needs to be regulated, the novelty of flying a UAS is, I think, rapidly coming to an end. It's nothing more than a platform that holds a data capture device, which we call sensors or payloads. And I think the majority of the market from the commercial side is not even in the visible spectrum. So you talk about other sensors and payloads, whether it's multispectral, hyperspectral, LiDAR, chemical sensing, radiation sensing. There's a whole bunch of other sensors and payloads that actually do nothing more than capture the data. And in my opinion, in order to monetize that, is you have to take that data and make it of value to whomever your customer or your consumer is. And so you capture those images, and then you have to do something with it. For example, for a hyperspectral sensor, it can capture 72 gigabytes every 60 seconds. So when you talk about a 20-minute flight or 30-minute flight, you're talking about terabytes of data. Now, how do you process that? How do you upload it? How do you manage it? And how do you publish it to your consumer? But at the end of the day, the UAS is a platform. The sensor is nothing more than data capture. It's the value of that data that is what people are willing to pay for, whether it's health of crops, whether it's sub-centimeter accuracy for engineering firms for surveys, whether it's bridge inspection or infrastructure inspection. How do we get behind? As Grant mentioned, I'm batting cleanup, and so this is just a summary. We won't go through it, just the bureaucracies and trying to get everything through the federal government. You already understand that the United States is not a leader in this industry. We're well behind Canada and Australia. Japan has been using the RMAX for 23 years. Israel. There's a number of other countries that are way ahead of the United States. as a U.S. citizen, I do think that the United States can make up ground on it. I think we do have the ability to do that. I think we're resilient. But it is important to educate our state leaders, our federal leaders on the benefits of the UAS and the economic opportunities that we have moving forward. Here's some more slides that Jim was talking about, the economic opportunities. That U.S. innovation is not waiting for the governmental agencies. I think we've got past the fear of the word drone, drone being primarily used for military aspect, and now people are understanding that it's more of a tool that can be used for both good and for evil. I'd like to publicly acknowledge Senator Richter as well as Representative Smith for their introduction of the bills that were filed last week. And so we'll be hearing more from them later today. But I think the primary issue that we have in the United States is one of education. And that's what we're here to try to do, is try to educate people to understand what is happening in front of us. And we can't stick our head in the sand, so to speak. So what is legal? And that was the gray area that Brent had gone through several times between, he's saying hobbyist, I'll say commercial or private sector or for-profit industries. We talked about, Jim Kuzma talked about the COAs and the airspace for the public sector. I'm going to talk about the airspace for the private sector, the 333 waiver, which in situ has, and then the special authorization certificate experimental class, which is incredibly expensive, and it's not something that most businesses are going to go through. Why is there confusion? We've already talked about the gray area. I'm not going to bore you with it anymore. However, back in 1981 was the advisory circular when the FAA had an opportunity to start dealing with this even on a most basic level, and they had decided not to. And people often reference the hobbyist law. I want to be clear that it's not a law at all. It's nothing more than a set of guidelines. There's no punitive or statutory damages that were associated with it. And so when people say, oh, I'm following the hobbyist law, that is not an accurate statement. It's not actually a law. It was nothing more than an advisory circular, and it was voluntary. And then when they came out with their clarification in 2007, it wasn't really that much more clear either. I will say if you get a COA or a 333 waiver, that is in fact law. So a lot of the, very similar to the guidelines of 9157, are in fact actually law regulatory requirements when you get a 333 waiver or a COA. So this is another way of showing what Brent had spoken about as far as civil disobedience, which I liked. As far as what are people doing for profit, and how can the FAA regulate it? Do they have the airspace police, so to speak? And I think we're all in agreement the answer to that is no. The FAA doesn't have the resources or the time to track down everybody that's flying UAS for profit. But what I found most interesting was in the Wall Street Journal last week. I don't know how many of you saw it on the 19th. They came out with big businesses that admitted publicly to using UAS without a waiver, without a COA, for their businesses. So Titan, Rio, BMW, there's 5 or 6, there's a whole slew of them that came out and announced that they were using UAS for commercial gain without waivers and without COAs. So I found that was interesting because they basically said the FAA, it's in a gray area, and if you want to come after us, you can come try because of their, I would say, limited success with their 2 lawsuits thus far. We talked about Raphael Perker versus the FAA, and the outcome of that, which I think was $1,100, I think is what the settlement came out to. And then the other one was EcuSearch. For those of you who know, EcuSearch is a search and rescue firm out of Texas that used UAS to find missing children, missing bodies, and they've been using UAS as a tool for many, many years, and the FAA rescinded on that as well. But the interesting point is that we have both small business and big business now that's putting pressure on the bureaucracies to move forward because that they are continuing to move, they're continuing to use UAS for profit without necessarily bureaucracy, paperwork, I guess, for lack of a better word. That's a reference to the Wall Street article. The laws will ultimately be technology agnostic, which has not necessarily happened at this point in time. The Supreme Court has not defined personal airspace, and so the navigable airspace that we talked about previously, you're saying 10 feet out in front of the mall, and then they go inside and fly what's personal and what's not. The National Airspace System oftentimes references their airspace from the surface up to and including an X amount, such as 10,000 feet. But they haven't defined what is personal airspace. So if somebody's flying a drone within 3 feet of my face, that's invading my personal airspace. Well, what if it's 50 feet or 100 feet or 150 feet? That has not been defined by the Supreme Court. But we are just at the beginning of a wave of regulation, which I think is good right now. We definitely need it. I'm not a big fan of big government, but we definitely need guidance because without it, we're going to get black eyes from people that are not doing it properly. One other thing that I want to mention as far as what big businesses are doing, those of you may or may not know that you can currently purchase general liability insurance for flying UAS for commercial practice. So there's several insurance agencies out there now that you can say, I'm flying a UAS for commercial purposes, and I want to get hull coverage as well as general liability up to $1 million policy. I asked them specifically, I said, well, typically with insurance policies, if you're doing something that is knowingly illegal, does that not void the insurance policy? And I got a very interesting response. And they said, we've taken that wording, that verbiage, out of our policy. I said, really? I said, do you have any other UAS companies in the United States? Yes, we do. I said, oh. I said, have you had any claims filed against your policies for flying UAS for commercial services? They said, yes, we have. And I said, did you pay on those policies? They said, yes, we have. I said, are they still your customer? They said, yes, they are. They said, their rates went up. But I find it very interesting. You talk about an industry that's as large as the insurance industry in the United States, where the FAA says that this is illegal to fly for commerce, yet the insurance company is saying, we will cover you. And this is not Lloyd's of London. These are US-based insurance companies. We have BMW. We have big industry that's saying, FAA, we don't really, I don't want to say we don't care about what you're doing, but when you look at the big industries that are doing it right now, the mining companies, so they're out there, as they're doing volumetric studies on their mines, they're not flying over people, they're not near an airport, they're at very low risk situations. Or with BMW on their commercials, when they're flying on the, driving on the Bonneville Salt Flats, and they have the UAS taking the pictures for their commercials, it's already on a closed course. So once again, they're being responsible with their actions of using the UAS as a tool. And so that's basically it. Thank you very much.
You've been a great audience. The panel is your panel. We have run over, so it's time for break time. But what I'd like to do is offer the opportunity to get at least 3 questions from the floor, and certainly your panelists are going to be available during the break time. So please, if anybody has a question, please, Charlie.
Could the panel please comment on a couple of loopholes of flying on a tether and flying in the warning area?
Excellent question. And I'm going to look at Paul, because I bet Paul has had those types of questions addressed.
Yeah, good question. Part 101 of the regs addresses tethered balloons. FAA right now considers tethered UAS as UAS. Okay, if it's not being used for, if it is being used for some kind of commercial advancement. But 101 is probably your closest path to determining exactly what the requirements are for that going forward. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. What they determined is that if it has any type of propulsion system on it, it's an unmanned aircraft and not a balloon. So they did put out a determination on that.
Okay.
So whether it's electric or any other fuel propulsion, it changes its status.
Right. What was your other question? I'm sorry.
So flying in the warning area off the coast.
Yeah, our understanding is that if the warning area is active, that airspace reverts back to the owner of the warning area, and FAA does not provide air traffic services in there. So, yeah, warning areas count as an opportunity if you can range with the owner of that airspace to operate UAS. So it counts much like a restricted area.
Can I add to that? I think the one you're talking about is off of the East Coast. I think the first thing you have to take a look at is that all ranges, all Department of Defense ranges are not created equal, right? The significance is that that is a test range. And so being a test range, it has some freedom to do different things. But as Paul said, technically it reverts back to Class G airspace through the air traffic controller. So out of Miami is what we're looking at. So now that's the FAA telling me that. The implementation is challenging, but that appears to be where it's at. So, but that's one of the differences that we said is that when you go to a Avon Park or you go to a Camp Landing, they're not considered to be a test site. So that military, right? That's where the DoD basically stopped use of those kinds of facilities. It just happens that that is considered a test range, and in being so, we think that's the opportunity to be able to use that with the definition. So does that help? Sure.
Good question. Another question. Sir.
Yes, I'd like to understand why the FAA doesn't learn from other countries' experience. You mentioned many other countries have been using these for many years. Japan, Australia, UK. Why isn't that experience transmittable to the United States?
Oh, man. Please, Brent, go ahead.
Well, they actually do cite Canada's rules in the NPRM. I mean, they are looking to what other countries are doing, and they do appreciate that the risk-based sort of approach seems to be predominant in countries that are a little bit ahead of us. They do acknowledge that. They just the U.S. national airspace system is the most complex in the world, and they just, I think, are a little more hidebound institutionally. And I do think they're getting a lot of pressure from their legacy stakeholders about being more cautious in terms of integration.
Very good. One more question. We had one over here? Not, sir.
Yes, I'd like to know what we have to do as business owners and AUVSI members to get to the FAA to get motivated and try to get this thing resolved by their deadline in September 15th. What has to happen? What do we have to do to make that happen?
Well, sorry, did you call it? So you were calling?
Please, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I think the FAA has a fair amount of pressure already on it I don't know that individual constituents can put additional pressure on the FAA. You know, they've already missed, they've been perfect. They've missed 23. They're 0 for 23 right now, their deadlines. What I would suggest is working through AUVSI and FPC is to work on educating your fellow citizens within your state and talk to your state leadership, because there's the two aspects of the regulations that we have. One's the federal overarching airspace FAA that you're not going to be able to, I would say, probably be able to influence individually very much. And there are a lot of really smart, really big companies that are already working with the FAA to do that. In my opinion, from a business owner standpoint, it would be to work with your state leaders and the state leadership to get pro-UAS legislation or business-friendly legislation at your state level, and also to try to prevent negative or anti-drone, anti-UAS legislation at the state level. I think we will be able to move further as a state, educating our state leaders and getting good legislation as opposed to working at the federal level.
Very good, Stephen.
And one of the things you can do right now that's very useful is submit comments to the NPRM. The comment period is open until April 24th. And I think any useful constructive comments that can be submitted, they will take into account.
And the panel's comments and your question is a great segue into the break time. And let me offer these couple of things. First, for those of you that are not familiar with the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, AUVSI, they're the ones that are presenting today's event. Their headquarters is in Washington, D.C. Become a member if you're not a member. And with that is benefits. And so for AUVSI, we promote the ethical, responsible introduction of these technologies into the community, hobbyist, commercial use, and otherwise. So there's also a code of ethics that is associated with the operation of unmanned airborne systems. And in fact, Space Florida used a code of ethics and used a training framework to fly the small UASs, which was responsible and ethical when they did the demonstration in May. So if nothing else, as being informed Floridians, understand your responsibility, your accountability as we move forward in this new revolutionary age. Now, there's been a positive bill, a supportive bill that's been introduced. We've mentioned this before. Senator Riker and we have Representative Jimmy Smith co-sponsored that bill. During the break, I took the privilege of taking that bill. It's been submitted, and it is supportive of unmanned systems, drones in the state of Florida in very specific ways, for academia, for firefighting, for finding the lost child. And so what I did is took that, abbreviated it into a PowerPoint slide, some of those, it is lawful to use a drone in the state of Florida for, and it walks through, and that's just going to be up here. I'll just run that through, during this break period. You can look at it, comment on it. Go to your local politicians. Be supportive. Let's move these capabilities forward for the benefit of Florida's. And so on that note, I thank you very much for being here. We're into your break period. I apologize, but I would offer also, you couldn't get better panelists. Oh, by the way, these are experts, so thank you.